Hi everyone, Anthony Falcone here, and this is my end of course project. I'll be focusing on the life and impact of Malcolm X. So just a little bit about this timeline real quick. It's just an analysis of his life, and I really wanted to see how he contributed to the civil rights movement and what sort of impacts he made as a result of the speaking, his speeches, and the messages he was getting across. So let's begin with Malcolm X's birth. Malcolm X was born in Omaha, Nebraska. He was actually named Malcolm Little at his birth. He later would change his name, which we'll get into later. And he was born in the 1920s, a very difficult time for America regarding race relations. There was great inequality, and various organizations, such as the Ku Klux Klan, were extremely prominent, and it was a very dangerous time. You can go ahead a little bit later, just 1 year old, 1926, Malcolm X's family, Malcolm Little, they had to move away from their home in Nebraska as a result of receiving threats from the Ku Klux Klan. So clearly, right off the bat for Malcolm X, we see how racism had impacted his life. Now, obviously, he's 1 year old. That's not something he would remember. But I think it's worth noting that his parents were directly subject to this, and he had to be involved as, he was a child and had to be with them at all times. So he was very much related to this difficult event. So after moving on for a number of years and growing up, his father passed away when he was 6 years old. He had some difficulties growing up, and he eventually moved to Harlem, New York. And this is when Malcolm Little, we see a bit of a change, and we sort of see his adult form kind of take shape. At this point, he begins engaging with some illicit activities, and we can perhaps tie this to his dropping out of school. When he dropped out of school, he felt very discouraged by his teachers and educators as they marginalized him, because he was, in fact, African American. And this had a significant impact on him. I think it made him view the world much more negatively, and as a result, made him turn to this life of crime. So going on then to 1946, this life of crime didn't last very long. It was not sustainable. He was eventually arrested and sentenced to several years in prison. And while in prison, Malcolm X had a rather significant transformation, a metamorphosis, we could say. In prison in 1948, he would join the Nation of Islam. And he spoke closely with Elijah Muhammad. While in prison, he began writing him letters. And he wanted to observe his place in the world and really understand what he was meant to do and what he wanted to do as a result of how things have become, why they are the way they are, and why things needed to change. So this is all stuff that happened while he was in prison. It really helped shape his philosophy. In 1950, this is when Malcolm X properly changes his name, or at least starts calling himself this, in the sense when he's writing letters. And at the time in prison, he was writing many letters to the government, and while this was happening, he would sign his name Malcolm X. So a rather significant moment in his life. 1952, Malcolm X is released from prison on parole. This, allowed him to be more active with the Nation of Islam and get involved more with his community and really start reaching out to people. 1956, he marries Betty Sanders, who would later change her name. Significant time, though, because this marks the beginning of his family life, and perhaps even another change. Perhaps he did have a number of children, and I think it's not unwise to suggest that this formation of a family for him contributed to his new ideology, his new philosophies, and his desire to see changes. So then, after several years of working, within the Nation of Islam, looking to make change, he departed from the Nation of Islam And this I found significant. While he remained loyal to the Muslim faith, the Nation of Islam, I think he felt, was no longer, he'd taken it as far as he could, and he wanted to do more and do other stuff, and so he had departed from the Nation of Islam. In 1964, the Ballot or the Bullet, he gives a speech of the Ballot or the Bullet, and this is one of his more significant speeches and really had an impact. And this is where I see one of his major contributions to the civil rights movement. He had, he wanted to reach out to people. He wanted to reach out to people and let them know that they could make changes. He wanted to inform the African Americans he was speaking to that they could vote and that they could make a difference. So I have a short video here, and we'll listen to this real quick.
Now, if you and I leave it up to the moderate Negro leaders, they'll be able to trick it up and make the world think that they passed something that doesn't really mean anything. So what you and I have got to do is get involved. You and I have to be right there breathing down their throat. Every time they look over their shoulder, we want them to see us. We want to make them pass the strongest civil rights bill they've ever passed. Because we know even after they pass it, they can't enforce it. In order to do this, we're starting a voters registration drive. We have to get everybody in Harlem registered, not as Democrats or Republicans, but registered as independents. We're going to organize a corps of brothers and sisters who, after the city is mapped out, they won't leave one apartment house door not knocked on. There won't be a door in Harlem that will not have been knocked on, to see that whatever black face lives behind that door is registered to vote by a certain time this year. Nobody will have an excuse not to be registered. We'll ask him, let us see your card. If you don't have the sense of responsibility to get registered, we'll move you out of town. It's going to be the ballot or the bullet. After we get our people registered, we can then organize that voting strength and channel it in the direction that will get immediate results for the benefit of our people. We can sweep our enemies right out of office, but we will not be able to do it sitting around talking about select and elect your own candidates.
So that's the video on the ballot or the bullet, and I found this to be rather significant, this speech, because it says, I think, a lot about the ideology, the philosophy of Malcolm X. And it's what I think this main takeaway from here is he's reaching out to the community, informing them that they can make a difference. That's significant, but additionally, he's not immediately resorting to violence. I think Malcolm X is oftentimes remembered by a lot of people as being, a violent, divisive figure, or at least one who encouraged violence, and I don't necessarily believe this to be true. I think it was more, he was not opposed to using violence as a last resort if the rights for the basic rights for African Americans were not reached. And so here, I think this is a clear example of that. He's stating, I want, go out and vote. Everybody needs to register. There's no reason not to register to vote and vote, because your votes can make a direct difference in how our lives are. And he says, the ballot or the bullet, later on in his speech, it will eventually resort to violence if their first attempts to vote and to get the entire communities involved and to incite change fails. So I think, again, that's an interesting thought process, in the sense that you're going to attempt to incite change legally through the legislation, through voting. And if your voices aren't heard as they should be in the United States, a democracy, then there's more extreme measures that should be taken place. So that was the Ballad of the Bullet. And then we have his speech regarding the famous line, "by any means necessary." And this is again kind of playing on to how he was very much in support of, getting the public their basic rights and doing it legally. However, if that is withheld from the African Americans, then more drastic measures are perhaps necessary. So let's take a look at this short clip where it's mainly emphasized on that part of the speech, the line regarding "by any means necessary."
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
So again, see, he taken out of context without knowing the character and the past speeches of Malcolm X, it's easy to understand why some may see him as being an aggressive, divisive figure, but in reality, he was really stating that if things don't change after we do this process legally and try to incite change through the government, then we have a right to fight for our basic human rights by any means necessary. That's my interpretation. And I think these two speeches really had a significant impact. If you look at the date on this speech, June 28th, and the Ballad of the Bullet, April 3rd, both 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed July 2nd, I believe, 1964. So really, this all happened just a few months before major legislation was passed protecting African Americans, enabling to have these rights that Malcolm X was fighting for. Obviously, there was a long way to go and a lot to be fought for, but this is a great step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st, 1965. He was assassinated by a few members of the Nation of Islam, the organization he had previously been a member of and had left. And this left I think cemented his legacy. I think he could have had he had a lot more to say and a lot more work to do, and was a phenomenally I could have seen him easily as a political figure perhaps further down the line, but he was assassinated, thus ending his development philosophically and politically. And he was no longer able to reach out to people and to inform them of the importance of getting out there and trying to make a difference by voting politically and fighting for the rights however they could that they so desperately needed and deserved. But Malcolm X was assassinated, and that brought an end to that. But I feel brought his politics and his beliefs into this cemented idea, this legacy that will be carried on for generations and is still talked and discussed about very much to this day. So that's what I have on Malcolm X. Thank you so much, and have a great day.